Chapter 17. I asked if those were the Ewells sitting down there, but Jem told me to hush, since Heck Tate was testifying. I saw that Heck Tate had worn a normal suit and looked like every other man. The solicitor was named Mr. Gilmer, and he was not well known to us. He was from Abbotsville, and we only saw him when there was a trial. He was anywhere between 40 and 60. We knew that he had a slight cast in one of his eyes, which he used to his advantage. He seemed to be looking at a person when he was actually doing nothing of the kind. Thus, he was hell on juries and witnesses. They thought they were under close scrutiny, so they paid attention, but so did the witnesses. Mr. Gilmer was asking questions about what happened on the night he was called to the Ewells' house. Mr. Tate said, "I was fetched by Bob, Mr. Bob Ewell yonder, one night." "What night, sir?" Mr. Tate said, "It was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Bob, Mr. Ewell, came in. Very excited he was, and said to get out of his house quick. Someone had raped his girl." "Did you go?" "Certainly. Got in the car and went out as fast as I could." "And what did you find?" "Found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet, and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner, and said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson." Judge Taylor thought that Atticus was going to object, but he didn't. Asked her if he beat her like that. She said yes, he had. Asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Robinson's house and brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in. That's all there was to it." "Thank you," said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor asked if Atticus had any questions, and he did. "Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anybody call a doctor?" asked Atticus. "No, sir," said Mr. Tate. "Why not?" There was an edge to Atticus's voice. "Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something sure happened. It was obvious." "But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anyone send for one, fetch one, carry her to one?" "No, sir." Judge Taylor told Atticus that he had already answered the questions and to move on. Atticus wanted to make sure. "Sheriff," Atticus was saying, "you say she was mighty banged up. In what way?" "Well, just describe the injuries, Heck." "Well, she was beaten around the head. There was already bruises comin' on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before." "How do you know?" Mr. Tate grinned. "Sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye come in." "Which eye?" "Let's see," he said softly, then looked at Atticus as if he considered the question childish. "Can't you remember?" Atticus asked. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, "Her left." "Wait a minute, Sheriff," said Atticus. "Was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way you were?" Mr. Tate said, "Oh, yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face." Mr. Tate blinked, as if something had suddenly been made clear to him. He turned and looked at Tom Robinson, and Tom raised his head also. Something became clear to Atticus as well, and he asked the sheriff to repeat what he just said. "It was her right eye, I said." Atticus looked up at Mr. Tate. Which side again, Heck? The right side, Mr. Finch, but she had more bruises. You want to hear about 'em? Yes, what were her other injuries? Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet. All around her throat? At the back of her neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. You would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with. Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff, said Atticus dryly, and Mr. Tate fell silent. They were all finished with Mr. Tate as a witness, and he stepped down from the witness stand. Everybody shuffled about a bit, whispering to each other. Dill asked Reverend Sykes what that was all about, but he didn't know. So far, things were utterly dull. There were no arguments from opposing counsel, and there was no drama. All were relaxed except Jem. Robert E. Lee Ewell. In answer to the clerk's booming voice, a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the stand, we saw that he had wispy hair that stood up from his forehead, a nose that was thin and pointed, and no chin to speak of. Every town had families like the Ewells. They lived off of welfare. No truant officer could get the children in school, and no health official could free them from diseases that came from their filthy surroundings. The Ewells lived behind the town garbage dump, in what was once a Negro cabin. It's a square-shaped cabin with 4 small rooms. Its windows were just open spaces in the walls that were covered with greasy cheesecloth in the summer to keep out the varmints. Their yard was dirty and contained the remains of a Model T Ford, a discarded dentist chair, an ancient icebox, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycomb. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums. Geraniums are flowers, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson. People said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people thought there were 6. Others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed. Mr. Robert Ewell? Asked Mr. Gilmer. That's my name, Cap'n, said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Was the next question. Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead, was the answer. Judge Taylor spoke in a way that made all the laughter in the courtroom die down. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Yes, sir, Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor spoke again and informed Mr. Ewell that he will no longer take any obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom. Mr. Gilmer continued, Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, would you tell us, in your own words, what happened on the evening of November 21st, please? Well, on the night of November 21, I was comin' in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screamin' like a stuck hog inside the house. What time was it, Mr. Ewell? Just 'fore sundown. Well, I was sayin', Mayella was screaming, fit to beat Jesus. Another glance from the bench silenced Mr. Ewell. Yes, she was screaming, said Mr. Gilmer. Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and ran as fast as I could, but I run into the fence. But when I got distangled, I run up to the window, and I seen—" Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. "I seen that black yonder ruttin' on my Mayella." Judge Taylor used his gavel for 5 full minutes before the courtroom came to order. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and told Jem that he ought to take me home. Jem turned his head. "Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home." "You gotta make me first," I said, remembering Atticus's promise. "It's okay, I think, Reverend. She doesn't understand it." I was offended. "I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can." Reverend Sykes got nervous. "Mr. Finch know you all are here? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise, or you boys either." Jem shook his head. "He can't see us this far away. It's all right, Reverend." Jem won. He got us to stay. Judge Taylor finally got the courtroom back under control, and Bob Ewell looked mighty pleased at what he had caused. Judge Taylor threatened to clear all the spectators out of the courtroom if there were more outbursts. "Proceed, Mr. Gilmer," Judge Taylor stated. "Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter?" "Yes, I did." "You say you were at the window?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "Yes, sir." "How far is it from the ground?" "'Bout 3 foot." "Did you have a clear view?" "Yes, sir." "How did the room look?" "Well, it was all slung about, like there was a fight." "What did you do when you saw the defendant?" "Well, I ran around the house to get in, but he ran out the front door just ahead of me. I sawed who he was, all right. I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor squallin'." "Then what did you do?" "Why, I run for Mr. Tate quick as I could. I knowed who it was, all right. Lived down yonder in that nest. Passed the house every day. Judge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder. They're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property." "Thank you, Mr. Ewell," said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. Bob Ewell made a hasty retreat from the witness stand, but Atticus had also risen to ask a few questions. Mr. Ewell backed up to the witness stand, and the crowd laughed at him. "Mr. Ewell," Atticus began, "folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran to the house, you ran to the window, you ran inside, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you, during all this running, run for a doctor?" "Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened." "But there's one thing I don't understand," said Atticus. "Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition?" "I most positively was," said Mr. Ewell. "I seen who done it." "No, I mean her physical condition. Did you not think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention?" "What? Didn't you think she should have a doctor immediately?" Mr. Ewell in all of his life would never have thought to call in a doctor. It would have cost him $5. Atticus asked him if he heard Mr. Heck Tate's testimony, and he said that he did. Atticus asked, "Do you agree with his description of Mayella's injuries?" "How's that?" "Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened, that she was beaten around the—" "Oh, yeah," said the witness. "I hold with everything Tate said." You do. I just want to make sure. Which eye her left? Oh yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye. I holds with Tate. Her eye was blackened and she was mighty beat up, Mr. Ewell answered. Mr. Ewell, can you read and write? I most positively can. Will you write your name and show us? I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks? Mr. Ewell wrote his name. What's so interesting? He asked. You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell, said Judge Taylor. Mr. Ewell got angry and didn't see what being left-handed had to do with it. Mr. Gilmer asked him one more question. About your writing with your left hand, are you ambidextrous, Mr. Ewell? Ambidextrous means you can use your right and your left hand to write and throw things. I most positively am not. I can use one hand good as the other. One hand good as the other, he added, glaring at the defense table. Jem got excited. We've got him. I didn't think so. I knew Atticus was trying to show that since Mayella was mostly beaten on her right side, it had to be a left-handed person who did it. But Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too.